welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. China flies a spy balloon over the United States, adding to rising tensions between Washington and Beijing. North Korea showcases almost a dozen ICBMs and a suspected solid-fueled ICBM at a military parade. We will discuss how best to deal with the growing threat from North Korea and China.
If China threatens our sovereignty, we will act to protect our country, and we did.
In the studio with me, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin previously served as a Senior Director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Also joining us, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's new edited volume reviews the first decade of North Korean foreign policy under Kim Jong-un. Welcome to Washington Talk.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Cronin, in North Korea's military parade marking the 75th founding anniversary of North Korea's army, North Korea showcased a suspected solid-fueled ICBM. It looked longer, and the launch tube design was more complex compared to 2017. How much progress has North Korea made in its solid-fueled ICBM, and how much more of a threat is this to America?
Well, we know a solid fuel ICBM is part of their 5-year military plan. They tested an engine for this rocket in December, but they were presumably parading empty canisters for this solid fuel ICBM. So we're still waiting for a test, which may be coming in the next few weeks or months. So we do expect a test this year, and presumably they're closing in on that capability this year.
And Mr. Snyder, some 10 to 12 Hwasong-17 ICBMs were showcased, and Hwasong-17 can reach America. Is this a large enough number to overwhelm America's missile defense system? And is North Korea currently reached a stage where it mass produces and deploys ICBMs?
Well, the missiles that were on display were the missiles that North Korea wanted us to see. And I do believe that the idea is to signal an intent to be able to strike the United States and to be able to successfully overwhelm U.S. defenses. But as Patrick has suggested, in terms of actually attaining the capability necessary to pursue that intent, well, that's yet to come. And we don't know how long it's going to take.
So if you top 4 nuclear bombs on each ICBM and 10 to 12 ICBMs can overwhelm 44 ground-based interceptors. Do you think, Dr. Cronin?
Well, that's right. This is one of the other ambitions of Kim Jong-un, is to put multiple warheads on an ICBM. He hasn't done that yet, but now he has ICBMs big enough that, in theory, that can be done. So this is one of those projects he's working on. He announced this back in 2018 when he said he was going to sort of mass produce these missiles and nuclear warheads. He announced it again in 2021 when he said, I'm going to include these 15,000 kilometer ICBM like the Hwasong-17, build a solid fuel ICBM, and put multiple warheads. But he's still trying to achieve all of these things. It's a lot easier to show them in a parade when he controls all of the material and all of the cameras, and that doesn't mean they're all operational. So he's working on all of them, though, so we need to believe it and take it seriously, but he hasn't yet achieved his goals.
Now, Mr. Snyder, also on display were nuclear-capable short-range KN-23 and super-large multiple rocket launchers and tactical nuclear operation unit. Is North Korea clearly signaling that it is going to strike South Korea with tactical nuclear weapons?
I do believe that those missiles are an expression of a dual objective on the part of North Korea, both to suggest that they can strike the U.S. and to strike South Korea. And of course, the most worrisome aspect of that is that we appear on the Korean Peninsula over the course of the past year to have moved into a kind of preemption threat competition between North and South Korea that has been reinforced by North Korea's codification of its nuclear doctrine and its pledges to use preemption and its very sensitive responses to statements on the part of the South Korean government as related to its capabilities of preemption.
Now, Dr. Cronin, the United States is pledging strong extended deterrence to South Korea, but isn't North Korea having that ICBM technology? Isn't it also a threat to South Korea in a sense that North Korean ICBM technology can overwhelm U.S. nuclear umbrella, deterring the extended deterrence, so to speak?
Well, there's no doubt that North Korea would like to decouple the United States from its allies and from South Korea in particular. It's actually doing the opposite, though, in many ways, because it's not just the weapons that we're talking about. First of all, we have many more nuclear weapons than they have. We have a very strong alliance. We have 28,500 troops on the peninsula. That conventional force and South Korean conventional forces are a big part of extended deterrence, the system that we have for deterrence. So we're involved in this fight with South Korea if it breaks out. North Korea cannot use its nuclear weapons without possibly committing sort of suicide. So deterrence is still holding, even if the extended deterrence question and debate is raging because North Korea's capabilities are growing. There's no doubt that there's fear in South Korea that North Korea might be able to coercively use its nuclear weapons, might be able to decouple the alliance. But in reality, North Korea is driving South Korea, Japan, the United States closer together because it's not just trying to strike the United States. North Korea is trying to strike South Korea and Japan. So they would like to decouple. Decoupling is harder than you think.
Now, Mr. Snyder, in 1991, President Bush withdrew nuclear weapons from South Korea, persuading Seoul that this is to stop North Korea from developing nuclear weapons, and also promised to provide nuclear umbrella. In 1992, Joint Declaration on the Denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula was signed. North Korea has acquired nuclear weapons, and the United States has failed to stop North Korea's nuclear development. Why should South Korea believe in the U.S.'s extended deterrence promise now, after seeing what has happened in 1991 and beyond?
Well, that is a very complicated question, and there are some specifics that I could probably quibble with. As related to how the question was asked. But I think that the critical thing that question does is it highlights the potential challenge related to making sure that global policy on nuclear issues and peninsular policy are aligned with each other. And specifically, as we look at what the U.S. was trying to achieve back in 1991, well, they didn't have the benefit of the knowledge of what would come later. And at that time, the specific focus was on removing nuclear weapons from foreign lands and also using that gesture as a means by which to draw North Korea into talks. And so way back in 1991, 1992, the ultimate result of that actually was the agreed framework, which actually, in my view, might have been the last possible opportunity for us to actually be successful in grappling with capping and reversing North Korea's nuclear program.
Well, it is the same today that we can now look into the future.
That's correct, and we should be aware. We should always be aware of how our policy decisions at this point could create potential problems going forward. And I think that as we, if we look back, another issue that you raise is related to the Joint Denuclearization Agreement. And way too often, some of my American colleagues use South Korea's pledge as a way to try to lock them into no reprocessing. But the fact of the matter is that the North Koreans have defected from that agreement long ago. But there are other reasons why South Korea is maintaining its restraint as far as enrichment and reprocessing, including other bilateral agreements with the United States and including its adherence to commitments under the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Now, Dr. Cronin, North Korea has codified a doctrine of preemptive nuclear strike, and it appears to have 4 deployed tactical nuclear weapons along the border with South Korea last year. South Korea is facing the most acute nuclear threat next to Ukraine. Why should South Koreans believe in the U.S. extended deterrence, which has never been tested before, not once?
Right. Well, we can't prove that deterrence works because until you know it fails, that's when you know it didn't work. So it's very hard to prove a negative here. But 28,500 troops on the peninsula are the first part of that deterrence mechanism. Look at the strategic assets, F-35s, F-22s, the carrier strike groups, the joint exercises that we're doing with South Korea, the integrated command system. There are a lot of reasons why South Koreans should feel assured that the United States is in any fight that North Korea might start, despite its nuclear weapons, and that we have a bigger arsenal than North Korea, which means they cannot actually use those weapons without, again, risking their own survival.
Now, Mr. Snyder, you recently published a report saying that South Korea should expand civilian nuclear cooperation with the United States rather than going for indigenous nuclear weapons development. Why should South Koreans consider your proposal?
Well, what I was really trying to do is highlight and shift the cost-benefit framework through which South Koreans are looking at the nuclear deterrence issue. And by the way, in addition to bolstering civilian nuclear energy cooperation, I also recommended continuing in terms of strengthening cooperation to make more real the extended deterrence capabilities that we have, including moving forward in terms of doing tabletop exercises and other things like that. But essentially, you know, one aspect of the bargain, the original bargain between the U.S. and South Korea as related to nuclear issues, was the provision of civil nuclear cooperation by the U.S. to South Korea in return for restraint in terms of developing a nuclear weapons capability. And it just so happens that there are huge opportunities in the civilian nuclear market right now that simply cannot be realized by the U.S. or South Korea unless we work together. And so those are potential benefits that would be foregone if South Korea pursued an alternative route of developing its own nuclear capabilities. But there are also tangible benefits that can be realized right now, and focusing on both sides of the nuclear bargain is a way to change the perception of South Korea's choices in such a way that it bolsters the U.S. and South Korea working together.
And Dr. Cronin, if South Korea develops its own nuclear weapons, what will be the extent of damage and cost inflicted on its civilian program?
Well, we saw the fracas of just announcing that you might be interested in a weapon. When South Korea announced that, there was quite a sort of a lot of disagreement and discord in the alliance over that issue. I think the problem is that North Korea's nuclear weapons, it's not part of the international system, so it doesn't care about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It doesn't care about the sanctions regime because it's already loaded with sanctions. South Korea would be facing sanctions from the U.S. Congress, would be facing sanctions from the international community, would be jeopardizing their trade, their huge position in terms of exports for nuclear civil energy, but also for arms. So they have a lot to lose if they were to try to suddenly, abruptly change into pursuit of nuclear weapons.
So South Korea facing all those sanctions and economic burdens and blows, would that be any benefit to U.S. strategy in the region?
No, it'd be terrible for the U.S. The United States and South Korea are in a strong alliance that is in the interest of both of those countries. And South Korea needs to leverage our nuclear weapons for their defense, and we need to leverage South Korea's conventional forces for our defense and protecting our interests. That's the win-win for South Korea and the United States. If suddenly there's a rupture in this alliance and distrust grows, as it did, say, after the Vietnam War, and when the United States was disengaging from the region and South Korea was pursuing a covert nuclear program, that rupture could have really grown and disrupted security in the region and for the peninsula. This is the opposite today. Right now, we've got President Yoon and President Biden working hand in glove on this issue, even though they have different views on this issue, right? The South Koreans are very upset about what do we do? Those North Korean threats are growing. can't we have our nuclear weapon?
So you said it'll be terrible on America, but that's why there are some expectations in South Korea that U.S. may not sanction South Korea even if it develops nuclear weapons.
Well, the problem with sanctions is that they're done by many different actors, including Congress. There's a Glenn Act, for instance, which would kick in automatically. The executive branch under one president might not impose rapid penalties or pressures, but what happens to the successor? So, and then there's the international community, their private business. There are a lot of different elements that could sanction, in effect, South Korea's actions.
Now, Mr. Snyder, how fast do you think can South Korea build a nuclear weapon and build a nuclear weapon infrastructure?
That's a very hard question to answer, in part because we don't know the circumstances. You just pointed to the question of what will be the state of the U.S.-South Korea relationship. We know that South Korea is a latent nuclear power. It has technical capabilities. President Yoon suggested that this could occur relatively quickly. But there are, I think, specific aspects of developing a program that might take a lot longer and face a lot more headwinds if indeed it is being opposed by other parties internationally.
But having a nuclear weapon and having a nuclear force would be different. 50 to 100 weapons would be a different story.
Of course, and first you have to be able to develop the nuclear weapon, then you have to develop the arsenal. It's taken North Korea about 15 years to do that. Arguably, South Korea could do it faster. North Korea's program was developed under adverse circumstances, but I also don't think that it's going to happen within the course of a year.
Now, Dr. Cronin, there are some people in South Korea questioning how come United States has different civilian nuclear cooperation program with South Korea and then with Japan. Japan can reprocess spent fuel rods and enrich uranium. South Korea cannot. Why are they different? And should South Korea find room to actually enhance its capability to build nuclear weapons rather than openly discussing and weighing options of nuclear policy?
Well, it's a great question because it is the fissile material for nuclear weapons that prevents South Korea basically from taking their missiles and creating overnight a nuclear arsenal. The United States has always tried to block the spread of reprocessing and enrichment which could be used for nuclear weapons. And so ever since the Atomic Energy Act in the 1950s, we've had to negotiate individually, country by country, with our allies on nuclear energy, on civil cooperation. The cooperation on Japan, the real question is, why did we make the exception with Japan? And we made it in unique circumstances. It was the last decade of the Cold War. It was the 1980s. We didn't know it was the last decade of the Cold War then. And the Ron-Yasu, the Nakasone-Reagan relationship was close. And we were trying to encourage Japan to be central to taking on the strategic bastion strategy of the Soviet Union. I know this is much too technical for a short answer, but the point is there were strategic reasons, there were reasons of leadership, and there were reasons of the timing. We just didn't have the same kind of synchronization of those issues in dealing with South Korea on these agreements.
But if it's a strategic decision, that decision can be made on South Korea now as well.
It could be made. Yes, there could be a debate on this issue, and I don't want to open up a great controversy, but Americans need to understand that in South Korea, this is a burning question. Why can't we do our own nuclear independent weapon? And the answer is mostly, it's in your enlightened self-interest not to, is the basic answer. That may not be a satisfying answer, but when they look at it closely, they may find that they actually don't do themselves any favor. Leverage the American arsenal on South Korea's behalf. And that's what President Yoon's doing. Give me more of a voice, he's saying to President Biden. Give me more assurance that I will be part of this process. And that's what they're working on. They're working on this tailored deterrent system.
I mean, basically, the U.S. is following a materials control approach in order to try to manage nuclear nonproliferation. And I would argue that under that approach, it was actually the U.S. made a mistake in terms of providing permission to Japan to do reprocessing. And that in the nonproliferation community, if they had it to do all over again, rather than giving South Korea the equivalent capacity, they would like to roll back Japan's capacity, especially if we look at what has happened to Japan's nuclear industry and the incredible sunk costs that Japan has faced as a result of trying to build a fast breeder reactor.
Now, Mr. Snyder, some South Koreans are encouraged by American scholars who support South Korea's indigenous nuclear weapons development. But this could be quite misleading because aren't they actually asking South Korea to defend themselves? And under American First policy concept, United States do not want to protect a rich ally. Isn't there where they're coming from?
I think it's really the critical question on this issue, and that is whether or not it's hypothetically possible for the U.S. as an ally of South Korea to give tacit approval to South Korea's development of a nuclear capability, or whether it would mean a break in the alliance relationship. And I think that it's pretty clear that if it means a break in the alliance relationship, that's an incredibly high cost for South Korea. South Koreans have been making certain types of arguments that are designed to overcome that obstacle. But I would say that that debate is really in its initial stages, and it's probably going to have to develop for a considerable time before it's likely to be achieved.
You're only right because the same people are actually advocating for the withdrawal of U.S. troops in South Korea.
In some cases, but I think there are others who are essentially looking at the U.S. burden and feeling that we can trust South Korea to delegate some of that burden within the regional context.
Now, Mr. Snyder, China's spy balloon incident dealt a severe blow to the already strained U.S.-China relations. How does Washington and Beijing's tension impact their cooperation on the seeking solution on North Korea's nuclear problem?
Well, my metric for answering that question is actually that 10 years ago, Xi Jinping and Barack Obama at Sunnylands agreed that we could cooperate on North Korea. In 2023, I think that it's very difficult to imagine that Joe Biden and Xi Jinping would be able to come to the same agreement because of the level and depth and breadth of strategic rivalry between Washington and Beijing.
Now, Dr. Cronin, the balloon flew over Montana, over Malmstrom Air Force Base, which has fields of nuclear missile silos. How serious was this a national security threat to America? And are we at an inflection point where United States and its allies join forces against China's surveillance and information campaign, even including the Confucius Institute?
Well, this does open up the aperture on China's surveillance campaign. It's a global campaign, and it's comprehensive. It's even in this near space realm that these airships are flying in. And we're only now really finding out in the past few weeks and past few days the extent to which they've built this airship surveillance fleet under the People's Liberation Army, probably part of their strategic support force, which is the force that was created only 8 years ago to basically fight informationized warfare. That is to combine cyberspace and political warfare and electronic warfare. So that's the real threat that we're facing. It wasn't just the imagery or the signals intelligence about the radars over the Minuteman III silos in Montana. They might be picking up cell phone communications, very sensitive ones that nobody thought they would be picking up at that time. Who knows what else they're picking up? But we do know that this is now the beginning of a different kind of policy that we need to protect our homeland, to protect our allies against this massive surveillance and information threat.
Now, Dr. Cronin, will the U.S. now become more sensitive to Seoul's concerns over its air defense zone intrusion by Chinese warplanes? Before, sometimes U.S. expressed concern, sometimes U.S. says, go ask South Korea.
Well, I think we will be more sensitive to South Korea's incursions that they're facing from China, from Russia, into their KDIZ, into their defense identifications, air defense identification zone, and into their territorial waters and space. I mean, yes, we need to be more sensitive. I think U.S. forces who are on the peninsula are very sensitive, but Washington is far away and sometimes doesn't think that this is their problem on any given day because we're trying to protect a big border ourselves. But make no mistake, if China actually did something aggressively against South Korea, we would be protecting South Korea too.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Dr. Cronin, Mr. Snyder, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with UX experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.